The hearing was supposed to be routine, a formal review on judicial ethics, broadcast live from the Capitol. Rows of journalists sat poised with notepads, their cameras humming softly. But as soon as Justice Clarence Thomas took his seat, the air shifted. The tension wasn't political, it was personal. At the opposite end of the long mahogany table sat Rep. Jasmine Crockett, her signature glasses reflecting the glare of the overhead lights. Known for her sharp legal mind and unflinching composure, Crockett had earned a reputation as someone who never missed a beat and never backed down from authority. Thomas leaned into his microphone, his voice calm but cutting. "Congresswoman," he said, "I appreciate your enthusiasm for the law. Though I must say, legal nuance doesn't always come with passion. Sometimes it comes with understanding." The remark drew a low murmur from the audience. A polite man's insult wrapped in condescension. Crockett didn't flinch. Her pen hovered over her notes for a moment, then stilled. She looked up. "With all due respect, Justice Thomas," she replied evenly, "understanding the law also means understanding how it affects people who don't sit on the bench." Her tone was steady, measured, surgical. The room quieted. Thomas smiled faintly, clearly expecting a debate he could dominate. "Of course, Congresswoman. But I assume your experience in practicing law gives you a unique perspective on the Constitution." There it was, the mockery behind the smile. A Supreme Court justice questioning her credibility on live television. Crockett's eyes narrowed, but her voice didn't rise. "Yes, Justice," she said, leaning forward slightly. "In fact, my experience taught me that the Constitution was written to limit power, not to excuse it." The jab landed like a thunderclap. Gasps rippled through the chamber. Even some aides behind Thomas looked up, startled. Crockett continued, her voice calm, her posture composed. "You see," she said, flipping through her notes, "legal understanding isn't about memorizing precedent. It's about applying justice equally, whether someone wears a robe or stands before it." For a split second, Thomas froze, caught between a smile and silence. Cameras zoomed in. The networks caught the moment perfectly. Crockett, poised and unshaken. Thomas, momentarily speechless. That silence became the story. Within minutes, the clip hit social media. "Jasmine Crockett just schooled Clarence Thomas" trended within the hour. Analysts replayed the footage, frame by frame, dissecting the power dynamic, the veteran justice, the rising congresswoman, and the sentence that shifted the room's gravity. It wasn't just a rebuttal. It was a statement, one that transcended the chamber walls and ignited a national conversation about respect, representation, and what happens when arrogance meets intellect. And this was only the beginning. For a long moment, the entire chamber seemed to stop breathing. The echoes of Jasmine Crockett's words, "The Constitution was written to limit power, not to excuse it," still hung in the air like a held note. The usual shuffle of papers and clicks of pens had gone silent. Even the reporters, trained to anticipate sound bites, sat motionless, eyes wide. Justice Clarence Thomas adjusted his glasses. His trademark composure, the stoic mask that had carried him through decades of hearings, wavered for a fraction of a second. He glanced toward the committee chair, perhaps looking for a procedural interruption, anything to break the moment. But none came. Every pair of eyes in the room was fixed on him and Crockett. Crockett didn't press the advantage immediately. She let the silence work. Let it stretch long enough for the words to sink in. Then calmly she continued. "Justice Thomas," she said, "when people question judicial ethics, it isn't about politics. It's about trust. And when that trust breaks, every ruling, every decision carries the weight of that doubt." The statement wasn't accusatory. It was surgical. Each word struck with precision, forcing reflection without rage. Her tone carried neither fear nor fury. Just focus. Thomas cleared his throat. "Congresswoman, I've served this country longer than some members here have been alive. My record speaks for itself." Crockett's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "Indeed it does, Justice, and the people have been reading it closely." That line drew a low gasp from the gallery. The subtext was unmistakable, a reference to the recent controversy surrounding his undisclosed gifts and trips. Thomas stiffened, but before he could respond, Crockett continued, her voice rising slightly but never losing its calm edge. "The law," she said, "doesn't just belong to those who interpret it. It belongs to those who live under it. When the public starts wondering if justice is for sale, it's not passion that's missing. Sir, it's accountability." The committee chair shifted uncomfortably, trying to maintain order as murmurs rippled through the room. But it was too late. The energy had shifted completely. Crockett wasn't just questioning Thomas, she was redefining the entire power dynamic. For years, the Supreme Court had sat above congressional hearings like a distant fortress, untouchable, unchallenged. But here, in this televised chamber, the fortress had a crack. And the person holding the hammer wasn't a fellow justice or a legal scholar. It was a congresswoman from Texas who had come prepared for battle, but armed only with facts and composure. Thomas leaned back, visibly irritated now. "Congresswoman," he said sharply, "I suggest we remember the separation of powers before turning this into a spectacle." Crockett didn't blink. "Respectfully, Justice, the spectacle began when accountability ended." The room erupted, some clapping quietly, others whispering, a few even shaking their heads in disbelief. The committee chair's gavel pounded for order, but the moment couldn't be undone. The narrative had flipped in real time. What was meant to be another hearing on judicial ethics had turned into something much larger, a generational confrontation. Experience versus rising truth. Privilege versus principle. And Jasmine Crockett had just proven that calm conviction could cut deeper than a gavel strike. By now, the hearing had transformed into a theater of power. Every eye fixed on the unfolding clash between Justice Clarence Thomas and Representative Jasmine Crockett. The cameras zoomed in tight, capturing every flicker of expression. The tension wasn't loud, but it was electric, the kind that makes even silence feel amplified. Thomas, visibly uncomfortable, adjusted the microphone again. His tone sharpened. "Congresswoman Crockett," he began, "your passion for oversight is admirable. But you must understand, the judiciary cannot operate under constant political pressure. Our duty is to the Constitution, not to public opinion." Crockett didn't look away. She met his gaze head-on, voice steady as she replied, "And the Constitution, Justice Thomas, was written for the people, not for the powerful." The words hit like a gavel strike. The audience shifted, whispers spreading in waves. One reporter muttered to another, "She's taking the room." Thomas leaned forward, the faintest trace of a smirk tugging at his mouth. "You speak eloquently, Congresswoman, but you're young. Perhaps in time, you'll learn that not every accusation deserves oxygen." It was meant to diminish her, a calculated move from an old master of institutional language. But Crockett didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled, the kind of smile that said, "You just walked into my argument." "With respect, Justice," she replied, "the truth doesn't need oxygen." "It breathes on its own," gasps broke across the chamber. Thomas's smirk faded. For the first time, his eyes darted toward the press gallery, and he saw the flashing lights of dozens of cameras locked on him. He knew the clip was already viral before he even opened his mouth again. But Crockett wasn't finished. She turned toward the committee chair, her tone transitioning from confrontation to precision. "Mr. Chairman, this hearing is not about one man's service," she said. "It's about the integrity of a system that must never become untouchable. When questions about influence and ethics are raised, silence is not dignity. It's complicity." A wave of murmurs rolled through the audience. Some of Thomas's defenders bristled, whispering objections. Yet no one interrupted. The balance of authority had shifted. Crockett, once expected to play defense, was now dictating the tempo. Thomas's jaw tightened. "Are you implying, Congresswoman, that this court lacks integrity?" Crockett didn't hesitate. "I'm implying, Justice, that no court, no matter how high, should ever fear being questioned." The sentence landed like a verdict. The hearing room erupted in mixed reactions. Applause from observers, murmurs from aides, and visible frustration from Thomas's side of the table. The chair's gavel struck several times, but even that couldn't drown the sound of what had just happened. Crockett's calm demeanor stood in sharp contrast to Thomas's growing defensiveness. She had taken control not through aggression, but through articulation. She didn't shout, didn't grandstand. She simply commanded the conversation. And as the hearing continued, something extraordinary happened. Reporters stopped writing notes. They just listened, because in that moment, everyone understood. They weren't watching another political exchange. They were witnessing a shift, one where confidence, intellect, and composure finally outshone hierarchy. Within hours of the hearing's adjournment, the internet had exploded. The exchange between Justice Clarence Thomas and Representative Jasmine Crockett was no longer confined to the marble walls of Congress. It was everywhere. News channels replayed the footage in endless loops. podcasts dissected it line by line, and social media turned it into a full-blown cultural moment. The viral clip began, of course, with Thomas's mocking smirk and ended with Crockett's razor-sharp comeback. "The truth doesn't need oxygen. It breathes on its own." The phrase swept across platforms like wildfire. By nightfall, it was trending on Twitter, TikTok, and YouTube, captioned with fire emojis and phrases like "Jasmine the Giant Slayer" and "She read him without raising her voice." Cable news seized the spectacle instantly. CNN labeled it "A New Voice in Washington Power." MSNBC opened with a bold headline: "Crockett schools Thomas in live ethics hearing." Even conservative networks couldn't resist airing the footage, though their spin was very different. One Fox host dismissed it as performance politics, but his panelists couldn't stop replaying the moment either. For ordinary viewers, however, the reaction wasn't about partisanship. It was about poise. Crockett's response, cool, factual, and fearless, resonated with millions of Americans who were tired of shouting matches and scripted outrage. She hadn't humiliated Thomas with noise. She had done it with clarity. Clips of young law students breaking down her argument went viral overnight. Professors quoted her in lectures. Civil rights groups posted statements calling her the future face of constitutional accountability. One commentator tweeted, "She didn't raise her voice because she didn't need to." That's what power looks like when it's earned. Meanwhile, the backlash from Thomas's supporters was swift. Conservative pundits accused Crockett of disrespecting the court and grandstanding for clout. Yet, their anger only amplified her visibility. Every insult turned into another headline, another share, another discussion about whether the judiciary should remain above reproach. By the second day, Crockett vs. Thomas had amassed over 200 million views across social media. Artists began sketching digital portraits of the confrontation, Crockett leaning calmly into her mic, Thomas recoiling slightly, a visual metaphor for balance reclaiming space over dominance. Even late-night hosts couldn't resist. One joked, "Clarence Thomas brought a gavel, Jasmine Crockett brought the Constitution." Another quipped, "He tried to lecture her, and she turned it into a masterclass." But behind the memes and sound bites, something deeper was happening. Political analysts noticed a quiet cultural shift, a rare moment where the American public seemed to reward composure over aggression. It wasn't about who shouted the loudest anymore. It was about who stood their ground the smartest. In community forums and podcasts, young women, especially women of color, spoke about how seeing Crockett dismantle a Supreme Court justice without breaking stride felt revolutionary. "She showed us you can be calm and still command the room," one viewer said. The next morning, Crockett's office released a short statement. "I respect the institution of the Supreme Court, but respect should never mean silence. Accountability is patriotic." It was brief, elegant, and entirely on brand, the perfect echo of her performance in the chamber. By then, one truth had become undeniable. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just responded to Clarence Thomas. She had redefined the tone of political confrontation, and the nation couldn't stop watching. In the days that followed, the ripple effects of that confrontation spread far beyond Washington. What began as a tense exchange in a congressional hearing had now become a defining moment in the American conversation about power, gender, and accountability. Inside the Capitol, whispers turned into open discussions. Lawmakers on both sides quietly admitted that Crockett's performance had shifted the atmosphere. Staffers replayed the clip on their phones in hallways. Journalists compared it to landmark moments when young political figures had announced themselves on the national stage. But perhaps the most striking consequence was how differently the two figures emerged from the encounter. For Clarence Thomas, the fallout was swift and unrelenting. Commentators revisited past controversies surrounding his ethics, gifts, and political ties, issues that had simmered for years beneath the surface. Editorials questioned whether his dismissive tone toward Crockett symbolized a deeper arrogance within the judiciary. Overnight, old debates about transparency, influence, and judicial privilege were reignited. Thomas underestimated her, one political analyst said on air. He thought it was a sparring match. She turned it into a seminar on accountability. Behind closed doors, sources inside the court described an unusual tension. Thomas, normally stoic, reportedly told a confidant he had no interest in feeding the circus. But the damage was already done. The clip had transcended politics. It had become a cultural moment. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett's profile skyrocketed. Overnight, she went from being a fiery but lesser-known congresswoman to a household name. Her follower count tripled in a week. Invitations poured in from talk shows, podcasts, and university panels. She declined most of them, issuing a simple statement instead. "I don't speak for viral moments. I speak for the people who expect better." That humility only made her more popular. Grassroots organizations began circulating her quotes on posters and t-shirts. "The truth doesn't need oxygen" became both slogan and symbol, a mantra for a generation demanding accountability without theatrics. Civil rights leaders praised her as the modern embodiment of calm resistance, the same tradition of defiant grace once carried by figures like Shirley Chisholm and Barbara Jordan. Political strategists noticed, too. Inside Democratic circles, talk began about Crockett's potential future. Committee leadership, a Senate run, even a presidential bid someday. "She represents the next chapter," one strategist noted. "She's not angry, she's articulate." That scares the establishment more than anything. Yet, through all the acclaim, Crockett remained careful. She avoided direct attacks on Thomas in her interviews, often redirecting praise back to the broader cause. "This isn't about one justice," she told a morning show host. "It's about how every public servant, myself included, must remember that our authority comes from the people, not from power." In contrast, Thomas's media appearances dwindled. Conservative circles defended him fiercely, but even there, some quietly admitted he'd mishandled the optics. The video showed not a titan being challenged, but a titan being reminded that titles don't guarantee truth. The irony was unmistakable. By trying to dismiss Crockett's credibility, Thomas had unintentionally cemented her legitimacy. His attempt to belittle her legal skills had become the very moment that amplified them. By the end of the week, one editorial headline summed it up perfectly. "When Thomas tried to teach, Crockett made history. The hearing may have been adjourned, but the conversation it ignited was only beginning. A conversation about power, equality, and who truly gets to define professionalism in America's halls of justice." What the public saw that day was just the surface, a clash of words broadcast to millions. But behind the scenes, the aftershocks were far more profound. Inside Capitol Hill, the exchange between Jasmine Crockett and Clarence Thomas had shaken up the old order. In private meetings, congressional aides described a noticeable shift in tone. Senior lawmakers who had once dismissed Crockett as too bold now spoke of her with quiet respect. One senator reportedly remarked, "She didn't just hold her own. She held the court accountable." Committees began re-examining judicial ethics policies that had long gathered dust. The ethics reform bill, which had stalled for months, suddenly regained momentum. Lawmakers cited Crockett's poise as proof that accountability didn't have to come from hostility. It could come from intellect. Behind closed doors, allies of Thomas scrambled to manage the fallout. Conservative think tanks pushed statements defending judicial independence, hoping to redirect attention from the personal to the institutional. Yet, every attempt to reframe the story only amplified Crockett's composure. In the media rooms of Washington, editors debated how to frame the event. Some wanted to emphasize the generational contrast, the seasoned justice versus the rising congresswoman. Others focused on the symbolism, a black woman confronting one of the most powerful black men in America over questions of integrity. Whatever the framing, one truth held: the power dynamic had shifted. Crockett, for her part, refused to capitalize on the moment. Her team turned down high-paying speaking offers and television specials. Instead, she poured her energy into drafting bipartisan proposals for judicial transparency. "If we start with spectacle and end with silence," she told one reporter, "then nothing changes." That restraint made her even more formidable. Washington insiders realized she wasn't playing for headlines. She was rewriting the conversation. Meanwhile, whispers circulated that Thomas was avoiding public comment not out of defiance, but reflection. One aide suggested he was uncomfortable with how personal it became. But to the public, perception had already hardened. He had been challenged, and he had faltered. What began as a single verbal exchange had evolved into something larger, a quiet restructuring of power in the nation's capital. Crockett had proven that in a system built on hierarchy, sometimes one well-timed sentence could redraw the entire balance. By the end of the week, Washington was spinning. Every major outlet, from the New York Times to Politico to Fox News, had published think pieces about the now iconic face-off between Justice Clarence Thomas and Representative Jasmine Crockett. It wasn't just news anymore. It was narrative. And narratives, once they catch fire in DC, can reshape careers or end them. Cable networks turned the clip into a nightly segment. CNN analysts dissected Crockett's tone frame by frame. "Notice how she never raises her voice," one said. "That's the new playbook. Passion without pandemonium." Meanwhile, Fox News anchors criticized the media's glorification of disrespect, yet even they couldn't resist replaying the moment during primetime. On social media, the battle lines were clear. Conservatives rallied behind Thomas, branding Crockett's response as an ambush. Progressives hailed her as the new voice of accountability. Hashtags like #UnCrockett Effect and #Thomas Challenge dominated the digital space, trending for days. Behind the scenes, political operatives scrambled to control the fallout. Republican strategists worried that Thomas's perceived defensiveness had damaged the party's image among moderate voters. "He looked cornered," one GOP insider admitted privately. And when you look cornered, you lose control of the narrative. Democrats, on the other hand, seized the moment. Crockett's team didn't issue fiery statements or victory laps. Instead, they released a calm, policy-driven message emphasizing judicial ethics reform. It was a masterstroke. By keeping her focus on the issues, Crockett amplified her image as the adult in the room, while critics seemed petty by comparison. Late-night television capitalized on the frenzy. Comedy hosts turned the exchange into satire, contrasting Thomas's condescension with Crockett's calm confidence. The laughter was biting, not because it mocked Thomas's words, but because it revealed the imbalance of tone. Viewers could see what Washington insiders already knew. Crockett had exposed something deeper than ego. She had revealed a generational and ideological fault line in American politics. Even within the judiciary, whispers grew louder. Younger clerks privately admired Crockett's command of constitutional language. One reportedly said, "She reminded everyone that power is borrowed, not owned." As the story continued to dominate headlines, donations to Crockett's campaign soared. Grassroots support flooded in from across the country, from teachers, law students, and everyday citizens who saw in her a rare mix of intellect and restraint. Meanwhile, Thomas faced renewed scrutiny from watchdog organizations. Ethics petitions multiplied. For the first time in years, questions about judicial transparency were being debated on nightly television, not as abstract legal talk, but as a public demand. By the following Monday, political reporters agreed the exchange had transformed into a movement. Crockett had unintentionally become the face of a new kind of political power, one rooted not in outrage, but in precision. And Thomas? He had become the cautionary tale, a reminder that in the digital age, arrogance caught on camera travels faster than reasoned defense. Washington had seen countless arguments before, but this one was different. Because for once, the winner wasn't the loudest voice. It was the sharpest mind. Months after the now-famous confrontation, Washington still hadn't stopped talking about it. The moment when Jasmine Crockett calmly dismantled Justice Clarence Thomas had become more than just a viral clip. It had become a symbol of changing times. In classrooms, professors replayed the hearing as a study in composure, rhetoric, and the art of debate. In law schools, Crockett's handling of the exchange became part of discussions about gendered authority and the psychology of power in institutions historically dominated by men. One professor at Georgetown called it a masterclass in controlled dissent, but the significance of that day went deeper than academics. For decades, the American power structure, in law, politics, and media, had rewarded loudness. Those who commanded attention often did so by overpowering opponents rather than outsmarting them. Crockett flipped that formula. Her victory wasn't in volume, it was in restraint. And that struck a chord across generations. Public opinion polls showed a surprising result. Over 60% of respondents, including many independents, said Crockett's response represented the kind of leadership America needs more of. It wasn't about partisanship, it was about principle. People were tired of seeing power used as a shield. Crockett had reminded them it could also be a mirror. Within political circles, her rise continued quietly but steadily. She was invited to policy roundtables, think tanks, and international panels discussing judicial accountability. Unlike many who rode viral fame into self-promotion, Crockett chose substance. She introduced 2 bipartisan bills focused on transparency and ethics in the judiciary, both gaining rare cross-party support. That pragmatism made her even more formidable. Analysts began calling her the calm storm, a figure who didn't dominate with emotion but with intellect. In a city addicted to theatrics, that was revolutionary. For Justice Thomas, the long-term effects were more complex. He remained on the bench, his supporters as loyal as ever, but his image had changed. To the public, he now symbolized an era of untouchable authority facing overdue scrutiny. The once revered aura of judicial invincibility had cracked, not because of scandal, but because a single congresswoman had dared to speak with clarity. Cultural commentators compared the moment to other political turning points, when an unexpected challenger redefined the rules. Crockett's exchange wasn't just a political victory, it was a cultural reset, a reminder that intellect, when paired with authenticity, can outshine hierarchy. Even months later, clips from the hearing resurfaced every time a new debate about ethics or integrity hit the headlines. Her line, "The truth doesn't need oxygen, it breathes on its own," had become part of the political lexicon, quoted in speeches, printed on posters, and used in university debates. And so, what began as a single act of defiance evolved into something timeless, a recalibration of how America measures strength. Not by how loudly someone speaks, but by how unshakably they stand when challenged. In a capital built on noise, Jasmine Crockett had taught the nation a rare lesson. Power doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it simply refuses to bow. As the months rolled into a year, the echo of that hearing hadn't faded. It had deepened. The moment between Jasmine Crockett and Justice Clarence Thomas became a case study, a reference point, and, for many, a quiet revolution in how America views leadership. In every replay, one detail stood out: Crockett's composure. She didn't raise her voice, she raised the standard. And that difference resonated far beyond politics. It reached classrooms, community meetings, and even kitchen table conversations, where people began asking the same question: why do we mistake arrogance for authority? Her words, "The truth doesn't need oxygen, it breathes on its own," had taken on a life of their own. They appeared on posters, murals, and in social media bios across the nation. Activists quoted it in rallies. Educators printed it on classroom walls, and ordinary citizens adopted it as a reminder that truth, when spoken with conviction, doesn't need amplification. It simply needs courage. Justice Thomas, meanwhile, had receded into guarded silence. His public image, once nearly untouchable, now carried the weight of that single exchange. For the first time in decades, the perception of judicial power had shifted. The man who once represented permanence now stood as a symbol of how even the highest voices can be questioned. Crockett, on the other hand, wasn't chasing the spotlight. Her interviews were sparse, her focus unwavering. When asked if she realized how iconic the moment had become, she smiled and said, "I didn't go there to make history. I went there to ask questions." That humility, so rare in the modern age, cemented her place as something more than a viral name. She had become a quiet standard-bearer for integrity. Political analysts noted how the hearing inspired a new tone in American discourse. Lawmakers from both parties began to adopt her blend of calm precision and moral conviction. Debates became slightly less about domination, slightly more about clarity. Even if briefly, Washington remembered what it could look like when intellect triumphed over ego. And yet, beyond the headlines, the legacy of that moment lives in the pause. That stunned silence after Crockett's words, when the chamber realized that something had changed. It wasn't just a takedown, it was a turning point, because every era has its voice. The one that reminds a weary nation that truth doesn't scream, it stands. So as America continues to wrestle with power, integrity, and who gets to define justice, one question lingers in the air, echoing far beyond that chamber. When the next confrontation comes, will we follow the loudest voice in the room, or the calmest one with the courage to speak truth? If this story moved you, share it. Remind others that leadership isn't measured by control, but by conviction. Because sometimes silence isn't weakness. It's the sound of strength preparing to speak.